Mr. McCain, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, aye.
Any senators wishing to vote? The ayes are 82, the nays are 17. The confirmation is agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Thomas Edward Perez of Maryland to be Secretary of Labor, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate the Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations out of the Senate. The senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask for consent for 1 minute that I may be able to read a letter with regard to the upcoming vote.
Is there objection? The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President.
Senator Hart, the senator from Iowa is recognized.
Mr. President, is there a unanimous consent request pending?
There is a unanimous consent request pending that we proceed to the... Senator from Florida has asked for a minute, asked unanimous consent request for a minute to read a letter to speak to this nomination.
then I would ask for a minute following the senator from
Is there
Florida.
objection to the request from the senator from Florida? Without objection, so ordered. Is there a request? Is there a... Okay, senator from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we vote on this, especially to my colleagues on the Republican side, we're about to give 60 votes to a nominee who is not in compliance with a congressional subpoena. I have in my hand a letter just sent to me moments ago by Darrell Issa, the chairman of the Oversight Committee in the House, where he writes in part, Mr. Perez has not produced a single document responsive to the committee's subpoena. I am extremely disappointed that Mr. Perez continues to willfully disregard a lawful subpoena issued by a standing committee of the United States House of Representatives. This continued noncompliance contravenes fundamental principles of separation of powers and the rule of law. Until Mr. Perez produces all the responsive documents, he will continue to be noncompliant with the committee's subpoena. Thank you for your attention to this matter. He goes on to note, by the way, Mr. Perez has not produced a single document to the committee, therefore he remains noncompliant. Members, you are about to vote to give 60 votes and cut off debate on a nominee that has ignored a congressional subpoena from the House on information relevant to his background and to his qualifications for this office.
Senator's time has expired. The senator from Iowa is recognized.
Mr. President, again, this is just...
Senator from New Jersey is right. Senate come to order. Senator Harkin, senator from Iowa is recognized.
The contentions made by the senator from Florida are absolutely wrong. We had a hearing on this. We explored it in our committee. Instead of the 1,200 emails that they cite, we're talking about over a 3.5-year period, there were 35 emails located on his personal email that touched Department of Justice business and were not forwarded to the Department of Justice. And those have been looked at, and none of them demonstrate that he acted improperly or unethically. And when discovered, the emails were immediately forwarded to the DOJ server and are now part of the DOJ record retention system. I might add, the 35 emails were made available to the House Oversight Committee staff prior to Mr. Perez's confirmation hearing, and the Senate Help Committee staff have also been offered access to review all of those emails. So the contentions made by the senator are just absolutely wrong.
The question is the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Thomas Edward Perez of Maryland to be Secretary of Labor shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Gotcha, sir. Gotcha. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Gotcha. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Hi. You're an aye. Yeah. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown.
Aye. Brown, aye.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Did I hear him? Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Gotcha. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Sir. Thank you. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller.
I looked at the film and said, how did I skip it?
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. I gotcha. I did. Parker. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski.
Oh, yeah, I got the roll.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Nelson, Pryor, Sanders, Schatz, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, and Whitehouse. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Hall, Rubio, Scott, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Flake, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Rita, Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Lee, no. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no.
Yes.
Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.
I don't ever ask. Well, I'm just not going to ask anything. Well, then they should have done it by now. I think it looks really bad. And then I read at the top. I say closure's a grow August. On this vote, the yeas are 60, the nays are 40. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to. Senior senator from Washington State is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm really pleased that yesterday the Senate was able to come together and work out a bipartisan agreement to make some progress on approving President Obama's nominees. This is a great example of the kind of work that I hope we can do more of going forward because, you know, gridlock is really getting in the way of progress on far too many issues that affect our families and communities that we have a responsibility to serve. One of the most egregious examples of this that still remains is the Republican leadership who are blocking a bipartisan budget conference and the regular order that they called for in order, it appears, to gain leverage by manufacturing a crisis come this fall. Now, Democrats have come to the floor to talk about this a lot over the past few weeks, but unfortunately it seems to be getting worse, not better. We've heard from more and more Tea Party Republicans about their latest brinksmanship threat. They're now saying, defund health care reform or we're going to shut down the government. Now, Mr. President, I wish I was making this up, but it's real. The House has already tried to repeal this law 37 times. In fact, just for good measure, they're voting on it again this week. Now, we all know that's not serious. It is certainly not governing. It is pointless pandering, and it does absolutely nothing to help the families and communities we represent. You know, Mr. President, there are so many real problems we all need to be focused on. We need to protect our fragile economic recovery and get more of our workers back on the job. We need to replace sequestration, and we need to tackle our long-term deficit challenges responsibly. We've got to stop this lurching from crisis to crisis and return to regular order and give families and communities the certainty that they deserve. But the only way we can do that is if we all work together, and the last thing we need to do right now is to rehash old political fights. Now, Mr. President, based on what I'm hearing more and more of in recent days, not only are Tea Party Republicans willing to push us towards a crisis this fall, but they'll do that to cut off health care coverage for 25 million people and end the preventive care for our seniors that's free and cause our seniors to pay more for prescriptions. Now, these political games may play well with the Tea Party base, but here's the reality. Obamacare is the law of the land. It passed through this Senate with a supermajority. The Supreme Court upheld it. It is already, today, helping millions of Americans stay healthy and financially secure. So we should all be working together right now to make sure it's implemented in the best way possible for our families and our businesses and our communities. But instead, what we're hearing is some empty political threats and a push for more gridlock here in the Senate. Now, Mr. President, I don't think it's a coincidence that the very people who are pushing now for a government shutdown to defund the health care law are the ones who are blocking a budget conference. If your goal is to just simply push this country into a crisis, as it seems to be for the Tea Party and the Senate Republican leadership now, then those are the ways you do it. Now, when the Senate budget passed, I was really optimistic. We worked here for a very long time, hours and hours, well into the night, well into the hours of the morning, allowed everyone the opportunity to vote on their amendments. They were voted up or down, agreed to or not agreed to, and we passed a bill because both Republicans and Democrats said they wanted to return to regular budget order. And they said if we did that, we would get back to a responsible process. I took them at their word, but here we are, Mr. President, 192 days. At the time, we had 192 days to reach a bipartisan budget agreement, and 3 months later, now Democrats have come out here 16 times to move to the next step of the process, to get us to a bipartisan budget conference with the House. And each time that we've asked to do that, a Tea Party Republican or a member of the Senate Republican leadership has stood up and said, no, I'm not going to let you work out the differences with the House. We're not going to do a budget. We're just going to allow things to plod along here till we have a crisis in the fall. Now, Mr. President, there are now less than 3 weeks before we are scheduled to return home, all of us, to our states for constituent work. Well, if we can't get an agreement by then, we're going to return in September with very little time before a potential government shutdown on October 1st. Now, we still have a window of opportunity to reach an agreement before we're in crisis mode. I would tell all of you it is closing quickly. Mr. President, ask your constituents. They are sick and tired of hearing about gridlock and partisanship coming out of Washington, D.C. It's got to end. Now, this body had a great conversation on Monday night in the old Senate chamber. Everybody had an opportunity to have their say, and a group of Republicans led by Senator McCain, who are very interested in ending the gridlock, worked together with us to solve a problem. In fact, I have to say it's been very heartening to hear from the many Republicans who agree with the Democrats that despite our differences, and they are many, we should at least, at the very least, sit down in a conference committee, a bipartisan conference committee with the House and try to solve this problem and get an agreement. It started with just a few who are willing to stand up to their leadership, but Mr. President, I think we all should know that chorus is getting louder. Senator Moran, for example, said just yesterday, and I quote, "I too hope we can have a budget conference because the process needs to work." Now, I'm sure Senator Moran would agree with me that getting a bipartisan deal is not going to be easy. We know that. We know it's going to be difficult. But we all know it won't unless we get to work to now. So rather than risking our economic recovery and hurting our families and communities by manufacturing a crisis this fall, I'm really hopeful that the bipartisan spirit that we all move forward with this week will carry over into this budget debate. And rather than just listening to a few, Republicans will listen to the Republican members who prefer some bipartisan, common-sense approach to this over brinkmanship and chaos. So, Mr. President, we still have an opportunity to govern the way the American people rightly expect us to, and to come together and try and reach an agreement. And I am ready to go to work and sit down with the conservative House majority to try and solve a problem that all of us have come to Congress saying we want to work on, and that is a budget agreement. That budget agreement means certainty for our constituents. It means the ability, no matter how tough the choices are for us, and none of us is going to love any of them, we'll be able to give them certainty so they know how to moving forward. So, Mr. President, I would ask, as if in legislative session, that I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment, which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution that was passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 as amended be agreed to, that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate. That following the authorization, 2 motions to instruct conferees be in order from each side, a motion to instruct relative to the debt limit and a motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue. That there be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the 2 leaders or their designees prior to the votes in relation to the motions, and that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all the above occurring with no intervening action or debate. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object and in the spirit of bipartisanship, I'd like to ask my friend and my colleague from Washington to make a very simple modification to a request. I'm not objecting to a budget. I'm not even objecting to the idea of having a conference. I just want the debt limit left out of the budget conference. The debt limit is a separate issue, one that warrants its own debate, its own discussion, its own legislation. My request is a simple one: no backroom deals on the debt limit. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the senator from Washington modify her request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit.
Objection.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, let me just explain so that the senator understands. We are offering in this unanimous consent to allow the Senate to speak on the very issue that the senator is requesting, to do it in what a democracy does, and to allow an amendment on it and let the Senate speak. That's what we do here. And I would object to his motion, and I would re-ask for our unanimous consent that would allow an amendment on his issue of the debt ceiling and allow this body to speak on it before we go to conference.
The objection is heard to the Lee unanimous consent request. The question is the unanimous consent request from the senator from Washington. Is there objection?
Mr. President?
Senator from Utah.
In that case, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to talk about...
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Excuse me, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call off the quorum.
Objection so ordered. Senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now I rise to speak about the Gina McCarthy nomination to head the EPA, and in particular efforts that I've led with my Republican colleagues on the Environment and Public Works Committee to bring a whole lot more sunshine and transparency to EPA, something that's been sorely, sorely lacking for a long time and has been a particular problem, really reached new depths in terms of a problem in the last 4 years. Now, Mr. President, when this important nomination first came up, I focused specifically on these important transparency, openness issues. Now, I disagree with the Obama administration EPA on all sorts of substantive issues, including, for instance, to take the most obvious, their war on coal. I disagree with both the past administrator and this nominee, Gina McCarthy, on all of those key substantive issues like this war on coal. But I specifically chose not to focus on that in the nomination. I knew President Obama won the election. I knew he had a fundamentally different view than I do on those key environmental and economic issues. What I focused on with other Republican members of our committee was something that should be beyond dispute, beyond partisanship, really beyond debate, the need for openness and transparency with regard to what EPA does and why they do it. This has been a battle I've been waging for a long time, including on the EPW committee. And, Mr. President, I think this is a crucial issue. For a long time, EPA, under multiple administrations, has lost the confidence of Congress and the American people. It used to be, including when EPA was first founded in the first decade of its existence, that it was viewed as a non-ideological group of experts. It was viewed as being led by real scientists and real science, peer-reviewed expert science, not by ideology, not by political agendas, not by partisanship. Unfortunately, Mr. President, I think EPA and a lot of federal agencies, but EPA is perhaps the worst example, has gotten far afield from that. And it is viewed by most Americans, myself included, as led by ideology, motivated by partisanship and a political agenda, not sober, sound science. And that's why we need to get back to complete openness and transparency so that we see what EPA is doing, why they're doing it, and try to hold them accountable so that their decisions are based on objective science, not cherry-picking science, not partisan science, not what I would call New York Times or tabloid science. And again, those are what all of my key requests of EPA and the nominee over this Gina McCarthy nomination went to. Over many, many weeks, in fact months, Mr. President, I went back and forth with Ms. McCarthy and EPA over these very basic, sound, reasonable requests. And the good news is, although it took a lot of back and forth, the good news is in each of the 5 key categories I identified on behalf of all of the Republican members of EPW, we were able to secure real, meaningful, and substantial commitments in terms of moving the ball forward in at least 4 of those categories, and we're going to move the ball across the goal line in the 5th category as well. So let me briefly outline those 5 important categories that all relate to openness and transparency and where we're getting with regard to our agreements with the EPA over the last several weeks. Request number 1 had to do with FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Now, as anybody who's followed it in the news, EPA has really drug its feet and frustrated a lot of legitimate FOIA requests by private citizens, by states affected, by other stakeholders. The Freedom of Information Act was designed to put sunshine on the federal government, to allow everyday citizens, anyone, the ability to get basic, important information from any federal agency. And yet, as news releases and certain incidents illustrate over the last several years, EPA has really tried to frustrate that process. In fact, in certain documents we were able to obtain, we even got an email from within the General Counsel's office at EPA instructing all of the satellite offices of EPA around the country how to frustrate legitimate FOIA requests, how to delay, how to frustrate, how to obfuscate. It wasn't about a particular FOIA request that they may have thought was out of bounds or inappropriate. It was just about how to frustrate in general. That is completely inappropriate. That's beyond the bounds of the law. So we talked in great detail to EPA about how they have to change that. And this basically summarizes the agreements we reached. First, EPA agreed to mandate the retraining of all of their workforce, 17,000 plus people, to tell them not how to frustrate FOIA requests, but what FOIA is about, how to live by the law, how to honor FOIA requests in an open and timely way. Secondly, EPA committed to issuing new guidance on records maintenance and the use of personal email accounts. One way a lot of folks at EPA clearly were frustrating FOIA requests is they would do official business on personal email accounts. And so when a FOIA request was made, their EPA emails were produced, but lo and behold, the really important stuff, the stuff they wanted to hide, was on their personal accounts. So that is clearly a pattern that's been used at EPA and other federal agencies to frustrate openness and transparency and FOIA. So EPA is specifically going to issue new guidance to say that is absolutely illegal, that is absolutely off limits. And most importantly, trust but verify, and here's the verify, the independent EPA Inspector General will complete an audit about all of this stuff. So we're going to put an end to FOIA abuse, and we're going to make sure every American has FOIA as a legitimate tool for information, for openness and transparency, as was intended when Congress passed that law. The second category that I focused on in my discussions with EPA were emails and communications, exactly what I was talking about before. There's been a pattern, and several high-ranking officials were involved, including Lisa Jackson, the former administrator. There's been a pattern of using personal email accounts, also fake email names, to, in my opinion, hide important information from the public. And the clearest example is what I said a minute ago. If you do the really important business on your personal account and somebody sends in a FOIA request and then the agency produces your official emails, guess what? The really important stuff isn't produced. It's hidden. And that has to stop. And so we demanded a lot of things in this category. First of all, the nominee herself, we asked her to review her personal email accounts and report back that she hadn't used it for agency-related matters. She did that. She confirmed that. Secondly, EPW continues to coordinate with the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee to obtain further information. We do not have, and let me be crystal clear about this, Republicans on the EPW committee have not obtained everything we've asked for or everything we deserve with regard to emails and communications. So we're working with the House committee with subpoena power, and we're working closely with them, and we're going to get, even if it takes using their subpoena power, what we deserve. And then both committees recently put the EPA on notice that they are considering issuing subpoenas with regard to just that. So this is the category where we have gotten the least from the EPA with regard to our discussions regarding the Gina McCarthy nomination. But I just want to make very clear so no one is surprised. We're going to get what we deserve, including through House subpoenas if it takes that. The third category that I focused on in my discussions with Gina McCarthy and the EPA are underlying research data. EPA has done a lot of really important rulemaking in the last several years, and in each of those cases, they base that rulemaking on specific research. One big problem is the world, the public, even including members of Congress, have not had availability of that research data so that we can simply sort of compare notes and enlist outside experts to say, look, does this data really lead to that rule? Does it really lead to that conclusion? Well, this has been an ongoing argument for a long time, and finally, in the midst of these discussions related to the Gina McCarthy nomination, we've scored a breakthrough. EPA has absolutely categorically committed to obtain the requested scientific information, that data, from the researchers, from the institutions that did the research. They will absolutely request that and follow up on that. Secondly, EPA has already reached out to relevant institutions for information on how to de-identify and code personally identifying information that may be in the data. None of us want personally identifying information. None of us want versions of the data that make it clear who individuals who are involved in the studies. We don't care about that. We want the overall data. And so EPA is already talking to the institutions about how to scrub the data so they don't give us what we were never interested in, personally identifying information. And third, for the first time, we should be able to determine if there is any way of independently reanalyzing the science and benefit claims for these major regulations, which are mostly the major air regulations that the nominee, Gina McCarthy, led the way on. So this really is a breakthrough because it's a path forward to get the underlying data so we can independently examine, have experts look at the data and ask, does it really lead to this regulation? Does it really justify this regulation? The fourth category that I focused on in terms of my discussions with the EPA over the Gina McCarthy nomination is economic analysis. By law, EPA, like other federal agencies, are supposed to do a cost-benefit analysis before they do a big rulemaking. So part of their rulemaking is supposed to be a cost-benefit analysis to see if the rule is justified. In my opinion, that cost-benefit analysis is done in such a way to be laughable in some cases, to be ludicrous. It is designed to reach a particular result, not designed to be an objective cost-benefit analysis. So we wanted EPA to go back to the drawing board, do an open-ended cost-benefit analysis, not designed to reach a particular conclusion, but just designed to truly, objectively compare costs and benefits. As a result of our discussions, EPA is committed to convene an independent panel of economic experts with experience in whole economy modeling at the macro and micro level. And they're going to review EPA's modeling and the agency's ability to measure full regulatory impacts. Now, that's sort of a bunch of gobbledygook, particularly this whole economy modeling. But that is where we need to do true cost-benefit analysis to look at all of the macro impacts, all of the impacts of a rule on the whole economy, not very narrowly define the analysis in order to get to a certain conclusion. A good example is we need, when they're doing rulemaking, to understand the impact on energy prices throughout the entire economy. That is often a huge impact of their rulemaking, particularly, say, in their recent air rulemaking, the so-called war on coal. We need to see how many jobs that really costs us in the whole economy. Otherwise, this idea of cost-benefit is not meaningful. And so they have committed to convene this independent panel. This panel will be tasked with making recommendations to the agency so that the EPA does it right, so that it is a significant, objective, meaningful cost-benefit analysis, not just an exercise they have to go through and that they design to reach a certain result. And the fifth and final category on which I focused in terms of my discussions with the EPA over the Gina McCarthy nomination was so-called sue and settle. Sue and settle is a tool that environmentalists and their allies at EPA have used with increasing frequency in the last several years, the last 5 years in particular. When the environmental left wants to reach an objective, what they often do is sue the EPA under environmental legislation and environmental statute. And so they're the plaintiff, and the Obama EPA are the defendants, and they have a lawsuit. And then after a few months, they agree to settle the lawsuit, and the judge signs off on it. Usually the judge is more than willing to do that because it gets a big and time-consuming and complicated case out of his hands, off his docket. Now, what's the matter with that? Well, what's the matter with that is essentially the environmental left and the EPA are on the same side of the issue. They usually agree on the fundamentals of the issue. The folks who are truly on the other side, who often include stakeholders, landowners, businesses, state and local government, they never have a seat at the table with regard to the settlement. So this is a behind closed doors negotiation, which is one-sided, which doesn't include anyone on the true other side of the issue, doesn't include landowners affected, doesn't include other stakeholders, doesn't include state and local government, which are often directly affected, which often have their role in some of these matters taken away. And so we need to make that sue and settle process more fair, and we need to take the abuse out of it. And because we discussed this with EPA, we got the following important concessions. First, it helps resolve some of the challenges with lack of public input in closed-door settlement agreements, otherwise referred to as sue and settle. EPA will publish on 2 websites the notices of intent to sue, and petitions for rulemaking upon receipt. So at least the world out there will know what's going on at the front end. At least the stakeholders, the landowners, state and local government, other affected parties will know what's going on. Secondly, the web address for the petitions for rulemaking are that, and the web address for the notices of intent to sue is that. That is very, very important notice with regard to potential sue and settle agreements so that affected parties can begin to have input. They can't possibly have input if they don't even know that there is a discussion going on and they don't find that out until the final result is announced. So, Mr. President, those are the results of our discussions with EPA. As I said at the beginning, I don't agree with Barack Obama or Gina McCarthy's positions on most of the big issues at EPA, including the war on coal. I don't agree with their actions that are costing millions of jobs around the country, that are increasing significantly the price of American energy. But I'm not going to be able to fix that given the last election. President Obama was reelected. What we attempted to do is talk to EPA about things that we should be able to agree on, things that should be beyond dispute, beyond ideology, beyond argument. And that is giving the American people, including their representatives in Congress, full and adequate information about what's going on, having people get the information they deserve, having that give and take, which is supposed to be there and assured, cleaning up abuses in FOIA, cleaning up abuses in private and hidden and fake email accounts. Those are abuses that have gone on at EPA for a long time and have been particularly problematic in the last 5 years. Those are the sort of things we're going to fix through these agreements. And I think that will get us down the road to having a real discussion about the true facts behind proposed EPA regulations, the true science, the true costs and benefit, and not allowing EPA to do so much that is so important behind closed doors without that full and open discussion of the true facts. I think this is an important step forward. That's why I agreed, as I promised to at the beginning of the process, to vote for cloture on the Gina McCarthy nomination if we made this important progress. I set that metric. I made that commitment at the beginning of the process. I didn't think we'd get nearly as far as we did in terms of commitments out of EPA. But since we did, since we made all of that substantive process, I'm certainly going to honor that commitment with regard to the cloture vote. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Cloture having been